My name is Mira Calder. I am 31 years old, and I live in Portland, Oregon. A city that wears its rain like a quiet secret, and its streets like a map I thought I knew by heart. A map that somehow forgot to tell me there were detours I could not see until they wrapped around my life and dragged me into a new direction I never asked for. I am not a loud person, at least not in the way some people are loud, but I am steady, the kind of person who collects small details and builds a sense of home from them. A studio apartment that looks out on a branch of the river when the light is just right. A coffee routine that never changes because it feels like a promise I make to myself every morning. Today I will hold things together. I will not let the world tilt too far. I work as a project manager at a mid-sized design firm, handling timelines and meetings and the kind of decisions that feel invisible when they go right but brutal when they go wrong. And I am good at it because I can read people as if they were blueprints. I can tell when someone is hiding a sentence they do not want to say, a glance that slips just a second too long. My girlfriend, Lena, is in many ways the opposite of me. She is sly with her charm. She moves through conversations like a dancer. And her eyes light up when she is believed, when she is told that she is seen and valued. And she has a hunger to climb, to make a mark, to do work that feels significant and bright and right. We have lived together for 2 years, and for a long while, our life felt like a careful balance. Two people who solved problems by listening to each other. Two people who could predict each other's moods like weather patterns and adjust in time. Two people who believed that love could be a steady practice rather than a spark of fireworks hidden behind every door. Act 1 began on a morning that was not special in any obvious way. A typical Portland morning with drizzle that clung to the street lamps and the air that tasted faintly like wet pine. And I went through my routine at work, nodding at Lena when she texted to say good morning, and that she would be late because a client needed a last-minute change. Nothing alarming, nothing that should have set off bells in my head, and that is how a quiet life can unravel. Not in a single shattering moment, but in a series of small, almost invisible tremors that accumulate until you can no longer pretend the ground is solid beneath your feet. The problem began not with a loud confession, but with a set of small, almost incidental things that did not quite fit anymore. Lena started arriving home later, not late by a wild standard, but late enough that the evenings we used to share over tea and soft lights turned into nights where she would say, "I just have to finish this thing." And then she would wander into the kitchen with the glow of her laptop behind her and a look on her face that was half exhausted, half distant, as if she had left her own life somewhere along the path between her desk and the door. There were the messages that appeared on her phone, quick exchanges that meant nothing to me at first, but the way she folded her phone away and said, "Just a friend from the office." The way she answered when I asked if she was okay, as if she were rehearsing to tell a story she did not want to tell. All these small signals added up to a truth I refused to name aloud in my own mind. Something was happening with Lena, something that was not about us as a couple, but about her own hunger for something she could not quite name. I will not pretend I found out in one dramatic moment. It was more like stepping into a room where the air has shifted, where the furniture you thought you knew suddenly looks unfamiliar, where the minute details you trusted. Like Lena's Sunday meals with a quiet, careful routine that tasted of garlic and lemon, or the way she would hold my hand for a second longer than necessary when we watched a movie, became hints that whispered to me to look closer, to listen for a sound that had always been there, but I had chosen to ignore. The thing that finally forced me to face the truth was not a single message or a single overheard confession, but a pattern that grew louder than the excuses Lena offered when I asked if she was okay. A pattern that sounded like a chorus of small, careful lies that explained nothing, but made a great deal of sense in a way that was almost too simple to bear. It happened after a long day when I came home earlier than usual because a meeting finished early and I found Lena's things out of place. The kind of chaos that was not typical for her. And on the couch lay her phone face up, screen lit as if someone else had been there and left a message that she did not want me to see. And when I picked up the phone and stared at the last few texts, it was not a damning revelation in itself, but a sentence fragment that told me all I needed to know without the words ever leaving the screen. "We need to talk when you get home, and I love you, but I am not the one you think I am." The words, not the meaning, but the words themselves were enough to pull the quiet threads of my life apart and leave me standing in the middle of a room that suddenly felt too large. A room that echoed with the sound of a future I had believed in, and which now felt hollow and uncertain. The nemesis in this story did not wear a mask or plot a grand scheme. It was a pair of very real, very ordinary things that can appear in any life at any time. Betrayal and fear, the fear of losing the life you believed you were building with someone you loved, and the betrayal that comes from someone you trusted who chooses a different path without your consent. Lena, my partner, the person who had promised to stand by me, became for a while a silhouette that wore my own fear back at me. A mirror that reflected not the face I had grown to love, but the ache of a future that might no longer be mine to call mine. The moment I said to myself that I deserved honesty, and that I would not live inside a house built on excuses, was the moment Act 1 became something more like a decision than a realization. I did not want to shout or to break things or to make a spectacle of our life in front of neighbors and friends. I wanted clarity, a path that did not end in anger or sullen distance, a path that would allow me to breathe again and to decide who I was when the person I had pledged myself to was no longer a partner in that pledge. So I did what any person who fears losing themselves might do. I told Lena I needed space, and I asked her to be honest with me about what she wanted and what she did not want to pretend. When she could not meet the request with truth, when she insisted on excuses like, "This is just a phase," or "We can work through it," I knew the truth would not be something that could be patched with more words. The decision was mine to make, not hers to enact upon me. I found a moment to tell her gently that I would be stepping back from the apartment, that I would be staying with a friend for a while, that I needed to disentangle my life from a story that no longer felt mine to tell. I blocked the messages and calls not out of malice, but out of self-preservation, because if I remained with an untruth in the air between us, I would forget who I was, and I could not bear that. Act 2 was the long, difficult act where the problem grew bigger even as I tried to shrink it to something manageable inside my own head. Lena did not disappear from the story, but she stopped being the center of it, and that terrible shift took all the sweetness out of our shared past. The days became filled with a kind of careful calculation. I would plan my talks, how to say what I needed without slamming doors or shouting, how to listen in a way that did not pretend away what I already knew. I attempted to approach the situation with a measure of compassion, partly because I believed in the good in people, and partly because I feared becoming a person I would not recognize if I allowed bitterness to harden my heart. I asked for the courage to face the truth, which was that Lena had made a choice that did not involve me, a choice that might have started years ago in some corner of her mind, and quietly grew into a new life she wanted to explore. I spoke with Lena not to demand an apology, but to demand a boundary, a line that would not be crossed again. I asked for honesty, for a call or a conversation where she would tell me the truth about what she wanted, even if that truth would hurt. She offered a version of the truth that was less a confession and more a retreat into excuses, into "this happened with a coworker," and "we were separated emotionally for some time." And while those words did not absolve her, they did create a clearer map of where things stood. It was not the confession I wanted, but it was something I could live with if I chose to keep faith with myself. When Lena admitted that the other person, a coworker at her firm named Alex, had become more involved than she had intended, that it had not begun with malice but with a slow erosion of boundaries, I felt a cold wind slide along my spine and then settle in the pit of my stomach, a realization that this was not a mistake. This was a choice to betray both of us in a way that felt at once small and devastating. The consequences of that conversation stretched far beyond the two of us. Lena suggested we try to keep some contact for professional reasons, since we shared a life and a project, and the possibility of an awkward but workable cohabitation for a time existed in theory. But I could not bring myself to pretend that there was nothing broken. The office inevitably became a pressure cooker, because Alex, the coworker Lena had grown involved with, remained in her orbit for several weeks after the truth came out, the two of them trying to navigate a professional boundary while their personal line had already blurred into something else entirely. I would run into Alex in the break room, a moment that felt like a skit in a play I did not want to watch, and I would carry the image of Lena walking past with a look in her eyes that was both apologetic and exhausted, a look I wanted to erase with a calm, professional tone, but could not fully suppress. The management at Lena's firm moved to separate them as much as possible, to keep them from sharing a room during meetings or being on the same project boards. And while this offered a measure of relief, the damage had already been done, not only to our relationship, but to the sense of trust that had underpinned my view of the world. For me, the hardest part was to reconcile the image of the Lena I had known with the woman who chose a path that did not include me. The more I tried to deny the pain, the more stubbornly it sat inside me like a stone, until I finally understood that the only way through this was to walk away from the life I had tried to hold together with patience and the belief that love could fix anything if only we talked enough. So I found a new place to live, a small studio that I could call mine, a place with a window that faced the neighbor's garden where the rosemary and thyme grew in a tidy little row, and the air carried the scent of rain and earth rather than the sterile scent of our old apartment after a long day at work. The move had a practical purpose and a symbolic one. It removed the daily reminder of Lena from the space I inhabited, and with it, the false sense that we could repair what had broken if we only remained in the same rooms long enough to pretend. I began to rebuild my life in steps that felt manageable. I bought a small lamp that cast a warm glow. I set up a routine that included morning runs along the paths that threaded through Forest Park. I went to therapy to learn how to hold boundaries and to understand that forgiveness does not mean forgetting. And I reoriented my social life toward people who believed in a life larger than one failed relationship. Work, which had always been a steady anchor, transformed into a sanctuary where I could prove to myself that I could still do good work even when my personal life was a tangle of unresolved questions. I did not rush back into dating, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to learn what it meant to trust again. To trust not just a new partner, but the idea of trusting in myself to choose honestly, to choose a life that would not be ruined by fear or by the memory of a betrayal. There were days when the weight of it all pressed down on me with a quiet, stubborn force, when I would wake up and the bed would feel too large and the silence too loud. But there were also days when I could feel the gentleness of a reconciled breath, when the sun found a gap in the clouds and light spilled across the room in a way that felt almost sacred. And I began to understand that my new normal would not be defined by the old life I had lost, but by the life I allowed to grow around the truth of what had happened. Act 3 came with a final test that was less about justice and more about self-respect, a last-ditch effort to decide what kind of person I wanted to be when the worst moment of my 40 days of heartbreak rolled around. Lena did attempt a last contact, a cautious message that arrived through a mutual friend who had learned what had happened from Lena, asking to talk, offering an explanation that sounded more like a well-rehearsed apology than a real admission of wrong, asking me to consider the possibility of friendship at some point in the future if I could only accept that what happened was not as simple as a black and white betrayal, but a complicated mix of fear and poor choices. I read the message a few times and felt the old pull toward understanding, toward the idea that maybe we could salvage something, but the pull was tempered by a stronger, quieter force inside me. A need to protect the part of me that believed life was not for second chances when the first one was enough to break a heart beyond repair. I replied with a careful note that was honest but reserved, that I would not close the door entirely on the possibility of moving forward in some distant way, but that for now I needed to heal and to define my own terms for any future relationship, that I would not tolerate a repeat of the pattern we had fallen into. It was not a dramatic confrontation, but a decisive act, and in its quietness, it felt like the most complete kind of victory I could offer myself. A promise to myself that I would not bend again to someone else's fear or to a desire that chipped away at my own sense of self. The final stage of this story does not end with the destruction of everyone who betrayed me, nor with Lena being punished in the way that revenge might imagine, but with something I had not expected. A new normal that felt more true to who I am than the old one ever had. It is not a fairy tale where the lovers reconcile, nor is it a tragedy where I am left defeated by someone else's choices. It is a careful, patient rebuild, a life in which I no longer measure my days by whether someone else chooses to stay or go, but by whether I am living with honesty and dignity. I found a rhythm that suits me, Mornings spent on quiet runs that clear my head, afternoons filled with work that makes me feel seen by my own eyes, evenings where I open a book or listen to a neighbor playing guitar and realize that there is still beauty in the world even when it has sent me a painful lesson. The people who surrounded me through the storm, the friends who rented a spare couch for the first week when I needed a place to land after a late night at the office, the therapist who gave me words I could hold on to when the ache was too heavy to bear. They reminded me that I am not alone in this, that there is a community that can sustain me even when the life I had planned feels like it has slipped away. There is a part of me that looks back at the old days and wonders if I could have seen what was coming, if I had read the signs with better clarity, if I could have asked Lena the hard question sooner, if I could have insisted that trust be a shared, deliberate act rather than a fragile assumption we both relied on too easily. But I also know that hindsight is a patient teacher who loves to point out the gaps in a life. And then, with quiet insistence, fills those gaps with a future that makes sense again. The twist in this story, the part that makes it feel like a reversal and not a mere ending, is not in what Lena did, but in what I found after the fact. A version of myself who did not crumble under the weight of someone else's choices, but who learned to hold the line between compassion and self-defense, between forgiveness and setting a clear boundary, between wanting to understand and insisting on being understood. The person I found on the other side of the betrayal is not the person Lena fell away from, but a version of me who could still dream and still work and still love, but who would demand honesty, and would demand that love be a gift freely given rather than a currency spent to keep someone else comfortable. In the end, there is a line I learned to say to myself when the night grows quiet, and the city outside my window sounds like a distant sea. I am still here, I am still worthy, and I deserve a life that will not be erased by someone else's fear or by a mistake that was not mine to bear alone. The memory of what happened with Lena and Alex remains a chapter I will carry, not as a wound to reopen, but as a lesson about who I am and what I will accept in a future I am still allowed to write. I do not pretend I am immune to the ache or that trust will never again feel like a risk. But I know now that a life built on honest effort and clear boundaries is a life worth living. A life that will not be persuaded by pity or pride to fall apart when the road branches and the old path no longer looks familiar. And if there is any silver lining to the mess I endured, it is not a sudden romance or a triumphant confrontation, but the quiet, stubborn knowledge that I have learned to set a course for myself, to value my own peace, and to walk forward with my head held high, even when the rain comes and the world seems to whisper that I should retreat. The city of Portland remains, of course, a place of rain and coffee cups and trees that shake their leaves like small prayers in the wind. But now the city feels different to me, more like a map that shows not only the places I have lost but the paths I still can take, and I am ready to walk one of those paths. One that leads toward honesty, toward healing, toward a life measured not by the mistakes that came before, but by the courage to choose a better tomorrow. Starting with the quiet decision to be true to myself, and to let that truth be enough for now, until a new story finds me and I am ready to write it in my own way, in my own time, in the language of a heart that has learned what it means to survive and to hope again.